a homeless man stopped JD Vance on the street, asking for just $1. What happened next had the entire crowd completely stunned. It was one of those great afternoons in downtown Cincinnati, the kind where the sky threatened rain but never quite delivered. The air felt thick with the smell of damp pavement and fast food grease, a mix of the city's pulse and its quiet neglect. Pedestrians moved with the usual rhythm, some with purpose, some lost in their own world, and some, like JD Vance, caught somewhere in between. Vance walked at a steady pace, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. Dressed casually, he didn't stand out much, just another man blending into the city. But even without the suit, people noticed him. A few stole glances, whispering to each other. Some recognized him from TV, others from the headlines. His name carried weight, but in this moment, he was just a guy. Walking past a row of aging storefronts, dodging the occasional scooter abandoned on the sidewalk, he heard a voice break through the city noise. "Hey man, can you spare $1?" It wasn't the first time Vance had heard those words. He'd spent enough time in places like this to know the familiar rhythm of street requests. Usually, it was a quick nod or a polite shake of the head, and then life moved on. But something about this one, maybe the way the man's voice wavered, or the way he didn't immediately make eye contact, made Vance slow his step. The man was thin, but not just in the way hunger wears someone down. It was the kind of thin that settled in the face, hollowing out the cheeks, making the eyes look bigger than they should. His clothes, a mix of layers that didn't quite match, told the story of someone who had learned to dress for survival, not style. His beard was patchy, more neglected than intentional, and his hands were cracked from exposure to the elements. He wasn't aggressive, wasn't insistent, just standing there, waiting, like he'd asked this 1,000 times before and expected nothing. Vance stopped. "What's your name?" The man blinked, as if thrown off by the question. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. Usually, it was either a bill dropped into his palm or a stranger walking away. He hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Eddie," he muttered. Vance studied him for a second, as if weighing something in his mind. Around them, people walked past, barely noticing. To them, it was just another exchange between a politician and a man most would ignore. But there was something about Eddie that kept Vance planted where he stood. Maybe it was the way his shoulders slumped slightly, not in defeat, but in exhaustion. Maybe it was the fact that, despite everything, Eddie had approached with a quiet sort of dignity. Not demanding, not performing, just asking. "You live around here?" Vance asked. Eddie let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I live wherever I can. You know how it is." Vance nodded, but he didn't reach for his wallet. Instead, he asked, "How long have you been out here?" Eddie shifted, glancing toward the street like he was considering whether to keep talking or just walk away. "Too long," he finally said. Vance exhaled, his breath visible in the cool air. He could feel eyes on him now. Someone had stopped nearby, maybe eavesdropping, maybe recording. He wasn't sure. It didn't matter. But what he said next would. And that's when everything took a turn. Eddie shifted on his feet, stuffing his hands into the pockets of his oversized jacket. The fabric looked stiff from where its original color had long faded into something between brown and gray. His fingers curled inside the fabric, gripping nothing, as if the motion itself kept them warm. JD Vance studied him for a moment longer. Most politicians would have already walked away, or, at best, tossed a few dollars to the man before moving on. But Vance didn't reach for his wallet. Eddie noticed. His expression flickered just for a second, between expectation and disappointment, like he had already rehearsed this outcome in his mind. "I just need $1, he said again, this time softer, as if lowering the price of his request might change the answer. Vance's response wasn't immediate. Instead, he glanced down the street, where a small group of people had started watching. A man leaned against a light post, pretending to check his phone, while a woman holding a grocery bag slowed her pace. A few feet away, a teenager hovered with his hands stuffed in the front pocket of his hoodie, eyes flicking between Eddie and Vance. The city had a way of turning private moments into public spectacle. Vance looked back at Eddie. "What would you do with it?" Eddie huffed out something between a laugh and a scoff. "Ain't that the question?" But Vance didn't smile. He wasn't joking. Eddie's expression hardened just a little. $1 don't get you much these days." He muttered, "Maybe a coffee. Maybe a piece of bread if you know where to go." A pause, then quieter, "Or maybe just a moment where I don't feel like nothing." Something in the way he said it sat heavy in the air between them. It wasn't defensive. It wasn't begging. It was just true. Vance's jaw tightened. He glanced at Eddie's hands again, still stuffed in his jacket pockets, fingers shifting as if trying to hold onto something invisible. "You used to work?" Vance asked. Eddie let out another laugh, though this one was bitter. "Yeah, before life got in the way." Vance nodded slightly. "What was the job?" Eddie hesitated, then shrugged. "Plumber. Not the fancy kind. Residential work mostly. Fixed leaky pipes, replaced busted water heaters." He shook his head. "Ain't much demand for a guy who don't got a fixed address, though." Vance didn't argue. He'd heard stories like this before. Some people fell through the cracks so fast, they barely had time to brace for impact. Eddie rubbed his chin, his fingers brushing over the uneven stubble. "So you gonna give me $1 or what?" Another pause. Vance's answer wasn't what anyone expected. "I'll give you something better." Eddie's forehead creased. "Man, I ain't asking for a sermon." "It's not a sermon," Vance said. Eddie stared at him, weary. Around them, the street noise seemed to quiet just a little, as if the city itself was waiting to see what would happen next. But whatever Vance had in mind, it wasn't going to be simple. Eddie squinted, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He'd been here before. Conversations that started like this usually ended with some lecture about self-improvement, bootstraps, or personal responsibility. He braced himself for the same. But Vance didn't launch into a speech. He simply asked, "When's the last time someone gave you a real shot?" Eddie's brow furrowed. "What, like a job?" "Like anything." The question caught him off guard. He blinked, then looked past Vance, as if searching for an answer in the cityscape behind him. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "Been a while." Vance nodded, as if he already knew the answer. "You ever try to get off the streets?" Eddie shot him a look. "Man, what kind of question is that?" Vance didn't flinch. Eddie scoffed, rubbing the side of his face. "You think I want to be out here? You think this is some kind of choice?" Vance stayed quiet, letting him talk. "I tried shelters," Eddie continued. "Half of them full up before I even get in the door. Tried work. You know what they tell me? Come back when you got a phone. Come back when you got an address." He let out a humorless chuckle. "Like I could pull that out of thin air." Vance crossed his arms, listening. Eddie shook his head. "You ever been homeless?" "No." Eddie smirked. "Yeah. Didn't think so." Vance tilted his head slightly. "But I've been poor." Eddie looked at him differently now. Still skeptical, but maybe a little less dismissive. "Yeah?" Vance nodded. "Grew up in a house where sometimes the heat didn't work. Where the fridge was mostly empty. I know what it's like to go to school wearing the same clothes 2-3 days in a row." Eddie sniffed, rubbing his nose with the back of his hand. "Yeah, well. Bet you had a way out." Vance held his gaze. Took a while. A beat of silence stretched between them. Around them, the small crowd had grown. People were lingering, watching. A man with a baseball cap held up his phone, pretending to check messages but clearly recording. A woman whispered something to her friend, eyes flicking between Vance and Eddie. Eddie exhaled sharply. So what? You going to sit here and tell me to pull myself up? That I just need to work harder? Vance shook his head. No. Eddie narrowed his eyes. Then what? Vance pulled something out of his jacket pocket. But it wasn't money. It was a small, folded piece of paper. He held it out. Eddie eyed it suspiciously. What's that? A name. A number. Eddie didn't take it. What for? Someone who can help. Eddie gave him a look. Help how? They run a program. Housing first. No strings. Eddie scoffed. Yeah, right. Ain't that easy? Vance didn't lower his hand. No, it's not. But it's real. Eddie hesitated. He had been given empty promises before. He had been handed flyers for shelters that were already full. Numbers for programs that had waiting lists months long. He wasn't sure if this was any different. But something about Vance's face, the way he wasn't smiling, wasn't trying to sell anything, made Eddie pause. Why are you doing this? Eddie asked. Vance's answer was simple. Because someone once did it for me. Eddie swallowed, eyes darting between Vance and the paper in his hand. But he wasn't the only one watching. And not everyone agreed with what was happening. Eddie stared at the folded paper in Vance's hand like it was a loaded question. He had seen handouts before, flyers for soup kitchens, worn-out business cards from social workers who never answered their phones, crumpled-up pamphlets from churches offering prayers instead of solutions. But something about this moment felt different. Eddie finally reached out and took the paper, but not without a skeptical glance. He unfolded it with rough fingers, his hands unsteady from the cold. The name written inside meant nothing to him. The number didn't either. It could have been real, or it could have been another dead end. He exhaled sharply through his nose. So that's it? He looked up at Vance. No dollar? A few people in the small crowd scoffed. Someone muttered something under their breath. The man with the baseball cap adjusted his phone, still recording. Vance stayed calm. Would $1 really help? Eddie let out a bitter chuckle. Wouldn't hurt. Vance held his gaze. Wouldn't change anything either. Eddie clenched his jaw. Man, I ain't asking you to save me. Just asked for a damn dollar. Another scoff from the crowd. A woman off to the side shook her head, muttering, just give him the money, man. Vance ignored the voices. His focus was on Eddie. You said you worked before. Plumbing, right? Eddie exhaled hard. Yeah. What about it? Vance pulled out his phone. There's a guy I know. Runs a contracting business out of Dayton. He's always looking for workers. He'll take a chance on people who need a second shot. Eddie squinted at him. You serious? Vance nodded. I make the call. You show up, you work, you get paid. No games. The crowd stirred. The teenager in the hoodie whispered something to his friend. A man near the curb, who had been watching silently, shook his head and muttered, politicians, man. Always a stunt. Eddie let out a dry laugh. So let me get this straight. I asked for $1, and you trying to give me a job? Vance's expression didn't change. I'm trying to give you a way out. Eddie stared at him for a long moment. His grip tightened on the piece of paper. He could feel the weight of every eye on him, waiting to see what he'd say, waiting to see if he'd take the offer or tell Vance to go to hell. Someone in the crowd finally snapped. "This some kind of joke?" The voice came from a man in his 40s, standing near the curb with a canvas grocery bag slung over his arm. His face was lined with skepticism, his mouth curled in disbelief. "He didn't ask for a job interview," the man continued. "He asked for a damn dollar. A cup of coffee. You really think a dude living on the streets can just show up to a job like that?" A few others murmured in agreement. Vance didn't look away from Eddie. "You tell me," he said. Eddie's mouth felt dry. His fingers twitched at his sides. He had been stuck in this life for so long, he wasn't sure if he even knew how to want something different anymore. The paper felt like it was burning a hole in his hand. And then he did something no one expected. Eddie's fingers curled around the paper like he was holding something fragile, something he wasn't sure belonged to him. His breath felt heavy in his chest. A job. A real shot. Not a dollar. Not a pity-filled pat on the shoulder. Something bigger. And yet, the weight of all the eyes on him made his skin itch. He could feel the judgment rolling off the people standing nearby, the ones who weren't homeless, who had homes to go back to, warm beds, and lives that didn't involve asking for loose change. "You going to take it or what?" The man with the grocery bag challenged, his voice sharp with something between disbelief and irritation. Eddie shot him a glare. "What's it to you?" The man scoffed, shifting the weight of his bag. "What's it to me? I've seen guys like you 100 times. Always an excuse. Always a reason why something ain't good enough." Eddie's jaw clenched. "Man, you don't know a damn thing about me." The guy laughed dryly. "I know you ain't worked in years. I know you're out here begging instead of trying. And I know you ain't about to take that offer." He shook his head. "And if you do, you'll quit the second it gets hard." The words hit harder than Eddie wanted to admit. His grip on the paper tightened. He wanted to tell the guy to shove it, to say he didn't know what the hell he was talking about. But the truth was, a small part of Eddie did wonder. If he still had it in him. If he could wake up at 5 in the morning. Push through the exhaustion. Show up and prove himself. And then there was the other side of it, the one that whispered, what if this is just another lie?" He turned back to Vance, eyes filled with something unreadable. "And what happens if this is bullshit? If I show up and they ain't got nothing for me?" Vance didn't blink. "Then you call me." Eddie narrowed his eyes. "Call you?" Vance nodded, holding up his phone. "I don't give people my number lightly. But if you show up and they don't give you work, you call me. And I'll find you something else." A murmur went through the small crowd. The teenager in the hoodie whispered, "Yo, is this real?" to his friend. The man with the grocery bag scoffed but didn't say anything else. Eddie felt his heart pounding in his chest. It was too much, too real. He had spent so much time expecting people to ignore him, avoid his gaze, pretend he didn't exist. But now, all of this, a job, a lifeline, it scared the hell out of him. He swallowed hard. "I don't even got a phone." Vance didn't hesitate. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, black burner phone. He held it out. "Now you do." The crowd went dead silent. A few gasps. Someone muttered, "No way." Eddie stared at the phone like it was a foreign object, his breathing uneven. No one had ever done something like this for him before. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any more intense, someone in the crowd spoke up and turned the whole thing upside down. A voice from the crowd cut through the moment like a blade. "This is all for show." Eddie's grip on the phone tightened. His heart, which had been pounding with something close to hope, clenched at the accusation. The man who had spoken was older, mid-50s maybe, with a salt and pepper beard and a flannel shirt worn thin. He looked at Vance, his arms crossed, his face hard. "This some kind of political stunt?" His voice was laced with suspicion. "Cameras are rolling, people watching, and suddenly you're out here saving a homeless man? What happens when they stop watching?" Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Some nodded in agreement, others looked uncertain. Vance met the man's stare without flinching. "You think I did this for attention?" The man scoffed. "Ain't that what politicians do?" Eddie glanced between them, something twisting in his gut. He didn't want to believe that's what this was. Didn't want to think he was just another pawn in someone else's story. But that doubt, so familiar, so deeply ingrained, crept back in. Vance didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend himself with flashy words. He simply said, "What I did today doesn't change just because people are watching. If you think it does, that says more about the world you've seen than it does about me." The man in the flannel didn't respond right away. He just shook his head, muttering something under his breath before walking off. A woman in the crowd spoke next. "So, what happens now?" Eddie blinked, realizing the question was aimed at him now. The question rattled around in his chest. He had the phone. He had the number. He had the chance. But was he really going to take it? He licked his lips, glancing down at the burner phone one more time before stuffing it into his pocket. "Guess I make a call," he muttered. It was the smallest commitment he could make. Just a call. Just a first step. Vance nodded. "That's all you gotta do." Eddie shifted his weight. "And if I screw it up?" "You try again." Eddie let out a slow breath. He didn't know if this would change his life. He didn't know if this was another false hope or the real thing. But for the first time in a long time, he had something, a name, a number, a phone. And maybe, just maybe, a second chance. Vance stepped back, giving him space. No pressure. No theatrics. Just a simple truth left hanging in the air. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone camera clicked off. A few people walked away, shaking their heads, still debating whether what they had just witnessed was real or not. But for Eddie, it didn't matter what they thought. This wasn't about them. It was about whether or not he was ready to fight for himself again. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and walked away. This time, with something in his pocket that wasn't just another empty promise. Not every opportunity comes in the form we expect. Some don't come at all. But when they do, when someone reaches out and says, "I see you," the hardest part isn't taking the help. It's believing you deserve it. Maybe Eddie makes that call. Maybe he doesn't. But the lesson here isn't about a guaranteed outcome. It's about what happens when we stop assuming people are beyond saving and start treating them like they still matter. If this story made you think, share it. You never know who might need to hear it today. And if you've ever had a second chance, drop a comment below. Because sometimes, knowing someone else made it through is all the hope a person needs. Make sure you're subscribed for more stories that challenge the way we see the world.